Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we're delving into the fascinating rise and hidden scandals of the Habsburg family, once Europe's most formidable royal dynasty. Emerging from the alpine regions of 11th century Switzerland, the Habsburgs grew to command territory stretching from Austria to Spain and even across oceans to the Americas and the Philippines. Their staggering wealth, estimated at today's equivalent of $500 billion, was bolstered not by constant warfare, but by strategic marriage diplomacy. Yet behind the glittering crowns lay dark whispers of inbreeding scandals, rumored curses, and fierce internal rivalries. What fueled their colossal power, and why did their line eventually fade out in 1918? Let's uncover the secrets of this legendary dynasty. It all started with a royal family's determination to fuse their realms into one colossal empire, a grand plan that seemed downright irresistible to the Hapsburgs of Europe. Their strategy for keeping power in the family was straightforward: marry within the dynasty, link the same bloodlines, and ensure that territory and influence never strayed from Hapsburg hands. This approach, as documented by numerous historians and highlighted in articles by National Geographic, might have worked on paper, but in practice, those perpetual intermarriages triggered a severe genetic fallout. One of the most distinctive markers was the notorious Hapsburg jaw, a form of prognathism that gave rulers like Charles V and Philip IV of Spain a jutted chin and an underbite so pronounced that it became a symbol of dynastic identity. Yet the ramifications of this inbreeding went far deeper than a protruding jawline. Problems with fertility, mental development, and general health plagued generations of the family. By the time Charles II of Spain passed away in 1700, so incapacitated that some courtiers doubted he could function as a true monarch, the Spanish Hapsburg line was on the verge of collapse. Throughout these centuries, family physicians and court officials tried to keep the worst details hidden from the public, creating a massive cover-up that continued behind palace walls. Records about diagnoses and the severity of these hereditary disorders were either hushed up or minimized, ensuring that Europe wouldn't question the viability of this once dominant house. In looking back at the Habsburgs' obsession with dynastic consolidation, it's tempting to see a straightforward narrative: royals who craved power above all else, marrying cousins to maintain a grip on the thrones of Austria, Spain, and beyond. But the historical reality is more complex. The Habsburg family branched across multiple territories, and political alliances often demanded that a Spanish Habsburg wed an Austrian Habsburg, or that a cousin from one branch tie the knot with a second cousin from another. These unions served a greater objective: holding on to vast lands that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the fringes of the Holy Roman Empire. According to genealogical studies referenced on Wikipedia and elaborated upon by genetic researchers in modern academic blogs, the inbreeding coefficient in certain Habsburg marriages reached alarming levels, surpassing what one might find even in many isolated communities today. While such unions cemented their political power for centuries, they also sowed the seeds for the genetic frailties that ravaged the family in the long run. The Habsburg jaw is the most visible sign of this unraveling. Formerly known as mandibular prognathism, it led to an elongated lower face, misaligned teeth, and speech difficulties. Royal portraits, many of which can still be viewed in European museums, offer a visual record of how this feature became more prominent with each generation. Scholars who study these portraits, along with modern attempts to reconstruct the Habsburg family tree, have discovered a direct correlation between repeated cousin marriages and the severity of craniofacial deformities. The phenomenon was hardly limited to aesthetic considerations. A severe underbite, an elongated jaw could cause chewing issues and breathing difficulties, setting the stage for a range of secondary health problems. Court physicians recognized that something was amiss but were under tremendous pressure to downplay any suggestion that the chosen family could be flawed. After all, the Hapsburg mythos was grounded in divine right, with the monarchy positioning itself as ordained by God to rule. Admitting that inbreeding had created a medical crisis would undermine that entire narrative. National Geographic, in various articles and TV specials, has emphasized that Charles II of Spain stood as a tragic exemplar of how dire the consequences of inbreeding could become. By the time he ascended the Spanish throne in 1665, Charles was beset by a multitude of physical and cognitive impairments. According to the accounts of ambassadors and courtiers cited in both primary source letters and modern secondary analyses, Charles II struggled with everyday tasks. He experienced difficulty speaking clearly, had a limited grasp of statecraft, and may have suffered from neurological problems that left him dependent on advisors, many of whom jockeyed ruthlessly for influence in the shadows. Some contemporary letters reference how Charles II's body was so weak that he could barely eat without assistance, let alone father an heir. Indeed, the question of fertility loomed large. For a dynasty reliant on producing the next king, failing to conceive a child was a catastrophe. Charles married twice, yet no offspring survived. Some historians argue he was effectively sterile from birth, a result of the centuries of compressed DNA from repeated intermarriages. Court physicians bore witness to these ailments, but operated under immense political pressure to keep them hidden. They crafted official statements describing the king as recovering from a slight indisposition whenever he suffered a near debilitating episode. Meanwhile, behind locked doors, they grappled with a patient so compromised that they doubted he'd live to see his 30s. In an era before advanced genetic testing, doctors could make only educated guesses about the root causes. Even so, based on diaries and medical notes that have come to light, some found in Spanish archives, others in private collections, it's evident that the Hapsburg monarchy tried to shield the extent of Charles's condition from foreign courts. They feared that if rival powers perceived weakness, they'd exploit it, potentially triggering wars or succession crises. To maintain an illusion of royal vigor, the monarchy even staged elaborate ceremonies, showing Charles performing simple tasks, like swearing in a new official or presiding over a court function, that were carefully choreographed to hide the king's difficulties. This concealment parallels other historical instances where powerful families tried to mask internal genetic or medical issues. Take the modern example of the DuPont family, which has faced allegations, explored by certain investigative blogs, and discussed in mainstream news, of encouraging cousin marriage to preserve wealth and keep corporate control tight. Just as the Hapsburgs faced rumors of widespread inbreeding, so too did the DuPonts handle persistent speculation of a hereditary strategy that favored internal unions, thereby protecting their interests. Another comparison might be the Medici family's attempt to disguise illegitimate heirs in Renaissance Florence, weaving them into the recognized lineage to maintain hold over city politics. Each of these families had a powerful brand to uphold: the DuPonts in the chemical industry, the Medicis in papal and banking circles, and the Hapsburgs at the pinnacle of European nobility. In all three cases, secrecy was crucial. Public acknowledgement of a dynastic flaw could lead to a collapse of authority or financial confidence. The case of Charles II's death in 1700 became the turning point that ended the Spanish Habsburg line. He passed away without an heir, and the subsequent War of the Spanish Succession erupted, pitting major European powers against each other for control of the Spanish Empire. That conflict, which splintered the continent for years, can be traced directly to the genetic dead end. Historians point out that if Charles had been healthy enough to produce children, the entire political landscape of 18th century Europe might have looked different. Yet the hush-up continued even after his demise. The Spanish court's official bulletins portrayed him as a venerable monarch who died of unspecified causes. Autopsy reports, to the extent they existed, were concealed or destroyed. Some bits and pieces have survived in private letters describing how Charles's body was so ravaged by disease and malformation that the embalming process posed extraordinary challenges. And while modern genealogists might see the inbreeding as an obvious culprit, the royal establishment of the day attempted to frame his death as the natural passing of a dedicated king, never admitting that generations of Hapsburg intermarriage had effectively doomed their Spanish branch. To dig deeper into the science behind these hereditary issues, modern geneticists have performed retrospective analyses on the Habsburg family tree. One influential study, often cited on Wikipedia and corroborated by articles in reputable news outlets, calculated the inbreeding coefficient for several Habsburg monarchs. Results showed that individuals like Charles II had coefficients that would make most genetic counselors today cringe. The relentless pattern of uncle-niece and cousin-cousin marriages created a closed loop of inherited traits, exacerbating disorders that went far beyond prognathism. Infertility, stillbirth, immune system weaknesses, and possibly learning disabilities all cropped up at a higher rate than the general population. The very strategy meant to consolidate power, tying family branches together so no territory would slip away, became the root cause of a biological meltdown. This meltdown was carefully kept under wraps by doctors on the royal payroll who recognized the risk of scandal. Some of their notes suggest that they used euphemisms to describe what any modern physician would label severe congenital defects. Despite the hush-hush atmosphere, artwork offers a curious window into what was happening. Many Habsburg portraits commissioned by the court come with subtle edits. Painters tried to minimize the appearance of the jaw deformity, or at least stylize it in a regal way. There are references in a few artists' diaries mentioning retouches or specific angles designed to make the subject look more harmonious. Scholars scrutinizing these portraits have noted that certain images present the royals in three-quarter view rather than a full profile, thereby hiding the extent of the protruding chin. In some paintings of Charles V or Philip IV, you can see hints of the Hapsburg jaw, but it's not as stark as one might expect. By contrast, lesser-known sketches or less formal artworks sometimes reveal a more dramatic prognathism, matching descriptions from eyewitnesses. This is art as propaganda, ensuring that the public never fully glimpsed just how severe the genetic traits had become. Philip II of Spain diverted shipments of precious metal arriving from Peru straight into the hands of inquisitorial officials, or so the Spanish archives suggest. Instead of being processed through the usual royal treasury accounts, certain consignments of gold bypassed official record-keeping entirely. Reports from archivists at the Archivo General de Sementes and the Archivo Histórico Nacional indicate that a portion of the bullion simply disappeared, yet reappeared as expanded budgets and newly appointed staff for the Spanish Inquisition. The king, forever styling himself as a champion of the Catholic faith, cloaked these transactions in the language of holy duty, ensuring that few would dare question why such funds never made it to the realm's official coffers. Evidence of these diversions pops up in shipping ledgers from the Viceroyalty of Peru, which included large parts of the Andes and territories in what is now modern-day Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. According to references in academic blogs and even footnotes in a few Google book sources, cargo manifests show more gold leaving ports like Lima or Callao than ever showed up at Seville. Storms and pirate raids might explain some losses, but the gap often aligns suspiciously with periods of increased inquisitorial activity back in Spain. That correlation stands out even more if you track the frequency of autos de fe, those public rituals where people convicted of heresy performed penance or were sentenced to severe punishments. Each major surge in Inquisition trials seemed to coincide with one of these missing chunks of gold. People in 16th century Spain were told this was all about zeal for the Catholic faith. King Philip II, widely lauded for his devotion, cultivated an image of austere piety. Wikipedia points out that he even spent significant time living within the religious atmosphere of El Escorial, a royal complex, half palace, half monastery. Many believed that funneling funds to the Holy Office of the Inquisition was a moral imperative, an act of righteous guardianship necessary to stamp out any trace of Protestantism, Judaism, or other perceived heresies. In an age fraught with the aftershocks of the Protestant Reformation, the monarchy insisted that every measure, however drastic, was justified to keep Spain spiritually pure. So, any rumors that part of that holy mission might actually be financed by gold stolen from the normal treasury channels barely had room to surface. Still, if you sift through the official ledgers, it's hard to ignore the numbers. Historians have noted that gold from the Andes dwarfed all other imports in certain years, with Spanish blogs on the topic referencing cargo logs that mention 40 or 50 extra chests of bullion per ship, a scale so grand that even small off-the-books diversions could generate tidy sums. Those sums, in turn, could bankroll the Inquisition's bureaucracy, inquisitors, jailers, scribes, spies, and the occasional torturer. When a tribunal decided to put on a large auto da fe, there were logistical details: renting a platform, distributing black robes to the accused, paying local officials to keep order. All that costs money. Royal finances in 16th century Spain were famously convoluted. The monarchy owed huge debts to European banking houses, especially the Fuggers and the Welsers, and had to juggle war expenses in the Netherlands, Italy, and the Mediterranean. Official treasury documents known as the Contaduría records list out sums for these major military campaigns. But what's odd is that there's comparatively little mention of direct funding for inquisitorial tribunals, even though the Holy Office's activities never slowed. One plausible explanation is that some of the American gold was handed over right away to inquisitorial agents, never leaving a trace in the monarchy's official ledgers. That arrangement let King Philip II appear free of direct responsibility for inquisitorial finances. If challenged, he might say, "I don't see any line item for that," thereby concealing his role in fueling one of the era's most repressive institutions. The monarchy had every incentive to keep these pipelines hidden. Unlike the more modern era, exemplified by figures such as William Randolph Hearst, whose lavish lifestyle and press manipulations were publicly known and frequently criticized, 16th century rulers operated under a shield of near absolute authority. They had no need to submit budgets to a parliament or face investigative journalism. Most Spanish chroniclers of the day were either under royal patronage or deeply wary of crossing the Inquisition themselves. If a writer dared to label the king a thief for channeling gold to inquisitors, that writer could wind up under investigation for heresy or sedition. Consequently, official narratives praised Philip II as a devout monarch, rarely delving into the financial specifics behind inquisitorial expansions. Documents from the period hint at the hush-hush nature of the arrangement. Some letters between colonial officials mention supplementary consignments, designated for ecclesiastical matters. Another letter might instruct an accountant to note certain missing funds as lost at sea or stolen by corsairs. Cross-referencing these notes with the volumes in Spanish archives suggests a pattern of conveniently explained shortfalls. Meanwhile, the Holy Office improved its capacity to track suspects, build secure prison cells, and hold grand autos de fe in major cities like Seville, Toledo, and Valladolid. This synergy strongly supports the theory that the king was funneling stolen gold, or at least gold diverted outside official channels, to keep the Inquisition flush with cash. There's a parallel often drawn to the earlier Capetian Templar purge in France. King Philip IV of France targeted the Knights Templar around 1307, accusing them of heresy, then seizing Templar assets to clear royal debts. Scholars note that, although the Spanish Inquisition under Philip II didn't exactly replicate that scenario, the same principle applies. A religious institution or a religious accusation serves as a front for the monarchy to handle large sums of money, bypass normal legal checks, and silence dissent. The Templar Purge was more about confiscation, while Philip II's alleged scheme was about routing colonial gold to a secret destination, but in both cases, religion provided the perfect cover. Comparisons also extend to more modern events. A widely cited parallel is John D. Rockefeller's role in the Ludlow Massacre era, when the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company faced violent clashes with striking miners. Though the context differs, the underlying theme is that powerful figures, Rockefeller, in that instance, maintained a facade of distance or ignorance while privately enabling repressive actions. With Philip II, the facade was religious righteousness. He posed as the devout king, leaving inquisitorial finances to men who presumably knew best. But behind the scenes, he's said to have arranged that stream of gold from Peru. So how do we trace the diversions? One method is to compare the Seville port records with the monarchy's internal account books. For instance, if a Spanish galleon arrived in Seville in 1580 carrying 200 bars of gold, you'd expect to find entries in the treasury logs acknowledging 200 bars worth of receipts or taxes. Yet in certain shipments, meticulously analyzed by modern historians, a chunk of the cargo, sometimes 30 or 40 bars, never appears in the main ledger. Even if we allow for smuggling, corruption among minor officials, or pirate raids, the repeated mismatch and the fact that these shortfalls match times when inquisitorial spending soared is telling. For example, the year 1580 coincided with an uptick in trials for alleged Protestant infiltration in Spain, requiring more prison guards and more official watchers. It's all circumstantial but highly suggestive. The question arises, why was the monarchy so intent on fueling the Inquisition? Part of it was genuine religious fervor. The 16th century was the height of the Counter-Reformation. Catholic powers like Spain and the papacy were pushing back against Protestant expansion. Another factor was that the Inquisition helped maintain internal discipline. By investigating and punishing heretical opinions, it effectively stamped out political dissent. Nobles or wealthy conversos who opposed the crown could be accused of practicing Judaism in secret. A rebellious pamphleteer might be labeled a Lutheran sympathizer, The Holy Office, armed with funds and legal authority, turned out to be an efficient weapon for social control. If Philip II wanted to remain the undisputed master of his empire, fueling the Inquisition was a good way to keep everyone fearful of stepping out of line. There's also the matter of the monarchy's broader economic woes. Spain was often on the brink of bankruptcy, forced to declare multiple moratoriums on its debts to European bankers. The crown needed to finance wars against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean and rebel provinces in the Spanish Netherlands. The famous armada that sailed against England in 1588 was another costly venture. Officially, the richest source of royal revenue was silver from Mexico and Peru, but a chunk of that wealth had to be spent on paying off loans or equipping armies. The Inquisition might have been deemed too controversial to fund openly at high levels, especially if the monarchy needed to reassure bankers that their loans were going to wage war or build up the Royal Navy, not to the business of rooting out heresy. Thus, diverting some shipments off the books allowed the crown to keep the official war chest focused on large-scale military campaigns, while the Inquisition quietly got the resources it needed through an under-the-table system. In that sense, calling the operation stolen gold might be complicated by perspective. From a modern viewpoint, gold assigned for the treasury but secretly given to inquisitorial agents does sound like theft. But for a 16th century loyalist, maybe the monarchy had every right to allocate gold however it saw fit, especially in pursuit of Catholic orthodoxy. The lines between personal royal property and national treasury were often blurry. The monarchy's moral justification was that preserving the faith was not just a personal obsession, it was a matter of state survival. If heresy spread, so the argument went, the entire empire would be at risk. Tying financial secrecy to religious zeal might have felt less like a crime and more like a necessary measure in a cosmic battle for souls. In the early 16th century, Europe was a hotbed of political ambition. Crowns shifted like pieces on a chessboard, and families such as the Hapsburgs, Valois, and Tudors all vied for influence that stretched across kingdoms. Amidst this backdrop, an event in 1519 would come to symbolize the raw power of money in shaping who wore the most prestigious crown of the day, that of Holy Roman Emperor. According to the Hapsburgs, to rule the world, Maximilian I, the head of the Habsburg dynasty, secretly funneled an astronomical 850,000 florins to a handful of key electors, ensuring that his grandson, Charles, soon to be Charles V, claimed the imperial throne. This gamble wasn't just an amusing side note in history, it was an outright bribe scandal that could have rocked the empire's credibility if exposed. And yet, with the connivance of papal allies eager to preserve the veneer of divine-sanctioned legitimacy, the entire affair was largely hushed up, echoing the sort of secrecy that powerful families and institutions have practiced for centuries, from the Medici's alleged papal manipulations to modern philanthropic image spin akin to Andrew Carnegie's carefully cultivated reputation. During this era, the Holy Roman Emperor was chosen by a select group known as the Prince Electors. These electors, archbishops, dukes, and kings, had the power to cast votes that determined who would take on the imperial title. While the system was designed to maintain a semblance of balance between the empire's diverse territories, money could tilt the scales rather dramatically. Maximilian I understood that better than anyone. He was nearing the end of his life, determined to secure the future of his dynasty. His grandson, Charles, was already Duke of Burgundy and King of Spain thanks to assorted family inheritances. But the Holy Roman Empire was another crucial prize, effectively encircling Europe with Habsburg lands. The only real threat came from Francis I of France, who was likewise determined to grab the imperial crown. France had grown strong, and Francis believed commanding the empire would elevate him above every rival monarch on the continent. The election in 1519, therefore, wasn't your typical ceremonial gathering. It was more like an auction, with Maximilian, and after his death that same year, the Habsburg faction, bidding ever higher sums to outdo Francis VIII. In the scramble, enormous piles of gold or their equivalents changed hands in ways we'd recognize as simple vote buying. But calling it bribery was not something a monarchy could openly admit. Papal and princely powers had carefully cultivated the notion that the emperor's authority descended from a lineage that stretched back to Charlemagne, endorsed by God himself. To reveal that bank vaults and hush-hush payments actually decided the outcome would be to tarnish the entire moral foundation of the empire. Hence the hush-up, with Pope Leo X, a Medici, ironically, and various cardinals looking on. The entire operation was cloaked in official statements about the divine wisdom of the electors. Evidence of these secret transactions surfaces in the letters and financial records of the Fugger family. The Fuggers were the preeminent banking house of the age, comparable to the Medici in Florence. According to surviving account books, scattered in archives across Germany and Austria, and partially discussed in scholarly blog posts and certain news segments exploring historical banking, Jacob Fugger, the rich, extended huge loans to Maximilian and Charles. These loans were not just for ordinary courtly expenses, they underwrote the bribe campaign. Some historians have pinned down a figure of about 850,000 florins, though currency conversions can be tricky, and some sources push the number even higher when factoring in side deals and personal gifts to individual electors. Charles V, ironically, had a complex moral stance regarding money and religion. As King of Spain, he would soon face the Reformation, Martin Luther's challenge to church doctrine, and mounting tensions that would reshape Europe for centuries. But in 1519, none of that overshadowed the immediate task, making sure the electors sided with the Hapsburg cause rather than Francis III. If the crown passed to France, the precarious balance that had defined Europe could collapse in short order. So the Hapsburgs saw bribery as a necessary evil, or at least a pragmatic move. Publicly, they would hail the election results as the will of God. Behind closed doors, they engaged in a cloak and dagger game of finance reminiscent of unscrupulous modern lobbying. Not that Francis I was innocent either. By most accounts, the French had their own war chest, also aimed at wooing the electors. But the Habsburg side had deeper financial backing from the Fuggers, and they played their hand more effectively. According to certain German archives, Francis's agents tried to match or exceed Habsburg offers, but they were outmaneuvered in timing and personal connections. Money does talk, but relationships can amplify its volume. And the Habsburg dynasty, through Maximilian's prior reign, had cultivated relationships with several key electors over the years. By the time everything was said and done, Charles V emerged victorious in the election, with the official coronation taking place in 1520. To grasp how large a sum 850,000 florins was, modern historians sometimes compare it to the entire annual income of certain kingdoms at the time. This was not spare change. Funding on that scale was the kind of outlay one might expect for a major military campaign, not a closed-door election. The Fugger records, which can be examined in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich and other repositories, list significant disbursements around 1519, some documented rather cryptically. Jacob Fugger's role in monarchy building is so legendary that journalists and historians sometimes refer to him as the kingmaker who never wore a crown. A few records refer to gifts given to the electors, described in code words like, for the safe conduct of certain matters. It doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to figure out what that implies. What about the cover-up aspect? People at the time weren't entirely oblivious to the rumor that large sums were changing hands. Even so, the official narrative insisted that the electors had chosen Charles because of his lineage, personal virtues, and the promise of defending Christendom against the Ottoman Turks, who were threatening Eastern Europe. Papal allies, including certain cardinals with strong Hapsburg loyalties, reinforce this story. They had every reason to do so. The Pope had a precarious hold on the Papal States, and a strong Holy Roman Empire under Hapsburg leadership provided a buffer against French expansion. If the empire fell into Francis I's lap, the balance that propped up papal power might tilt unfavorably. So hush-hush meetings between Roman Curia officials and Hapsburg diplomats hammered out a supportive stance. As long as no one spoke too loudly of bribes, official bulletins and sermons could paint the election as a momentous turning point for all Christendom. The dynamic recalls certain episodes in the Medici saga, especially during the era when the family produced multiple popes like Leo X and Clement VII. The Medicis, known for their banking empire, had sometimes twisted or concealed financial deals to secure papal positions. Students of Renaissance politics will find it hard to miss the parallels. Money, influence, and the church all swirling together in a pot of half-hidden deals. A modern parallel might be Andrew Carnegie's philanthropic brand management in the early 20th century. Carnegie famously funded libraries, schools, and institutions, building a reputation as a benevolent billionaire, yet some historians argue it was ghost-written philanthropy. In other words, Carnegie used philanthropic acts to overshadow earlier labor conflicts or questionable business practices, thus shaping how future generations would see him. The Hapsburgs similarly leveraged religious and moral language to legitimize Charles's ascension, overshadowing the gritty financial details that made it all possible. Then as now, image management often meant burying uncomfortable truths beneath a flood of inspiring rhetoric. When we talk about the emperor who bought a throne, we might think we're oversimplifying, but it's not that far from reality. Without the infusion of 850,000 florins to the right pockets, Charles might well have lost out to Francis I. The ramifications for European history could have been massive. Under Charles V, the Hapsburg Empire spanned from Spain, including its burgeoning colonies in the Americas, to Austria and large swaths of Italy. This newly minted Holy Roman Emperor found himself at the center of some of the 16th century's biggest conflicts: the Protestant Reformation, wars with the Ottoman Empire, and perennial rivalry with France. One wonders how different the map might look if Francis I had become emperor instead, but we'll never know because money changed the course of events behind the scenes. Bribery in 16th century Europe wasn't as stigmatized as it is in many modern legal systems. It was more like a recognized hazard of politics. Still, no ruler wanted to admit that the highest office in the land could be purchased. Even the electors, usually mindful of preserving a sense of honor, would have balked at being openly labeled for sale. So everyone had a stake in minimizing the scandal. Some sources, including a handful of letters from the Archbishop of Mainz, a major elector, show the Archbishop's anxiety over the rumors that he had accepted lavish sums. In official statements, he would say that Charles V was the rightful choice for spiritual and political reasons. Meanwhile, hush money allowed the matter to drift away from public scrutiny, overshadowed by the subsequent crowning ceremonies and the swirl of intrigues that came with Charles's rule. Was there a continuing pattern of Habsburg vote rigging after 1519? Some claim that the family continued to sweeten deals in future imperial elections. The Hapsburgs remained so dominant in the Holy Roman Empire that from 1440 to 1806, with only a few exceptions, the emperors were all from their lineage. Yet historians remain cautious about labeling every subsequent election as rigged. Some factors played to the Habsburg advantage, like lineage, political alliances, and control of large armies. Direct evidence of more bribe money, especially on the scale of 1519, is scarce. The original note states that these claims of ongoing Habsburg vote rigging are speculative, and that's likely fair. The 1519th episode stands out because we have fairly clear references from banking records and testimonies. Later elections might have featured smaller-scale bribes or plain old political intimidation, but the evidence is thinner. In digging deeper, researchers sift through electoral correspondence, letters between electors and ambassadors, diaries of key political figures, records from imperial diets, and the occasional reference in city chronicles. While most of these documents are scattered across European libraries, bits and pieces have been digitized. A few bloggers who focus on the Holy Roman Empire's intricacies rummage through these digital archives to highlight suggestive details, like an ambassador's note that a certain sum was forwarded to an elector right before a vote. But the scale and clarity that we see in 1519, courtesy of the Fugger Papers, is relatively unique. In that sense, the election of Charles V stands as a watershed in what we might call institutionalized corruption in the empire. Interestingly, Charles V himself felt uneasy about the empire's finances not too long after his coronation. Running such a sprawling domain was costly, especially once the Protestant Reformation got rolling and wars flared up. The new emperor found himself perpetually low on funds. Spain's silver shipments from the New World were often mortgaged or siphoned away to pay debts. The same Fugger bankers who had helped buy his crown now demanded repayment with interest. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, of Charles joking that the real rulers of the empire were the Fuggers, since without them, he'd never have been elected nor sustained the subsequent wars. Indeed, the intersection of imperial politics and big banking in the 16th century is a kind of precursor to modern entanglements between governments and major financial institutions. Meanwhile, Francis I never forgave the slight and spent decades locked in conflict with Charles, culminating in the series of wars known as the Habsburg-Valois rivalry. Some historians speculate that Francis's near obsession with challenging Charles on the battlefield was partly fueled by the humiliation of losing the imperial election. If he believed rightly or wrongly that money alone had swung the vote, that would have deepened his resentment. The story thus extends beyond simple corruption into the realm of grand strategic shifts. A bribed election begets a major rivalry, which in turn shapes how Western Europe wages war for decades. That's a testament to how pivotal a single behind-the-scenes financial scandal can be. Not many people realize that Joanna of Castile, known in Spanish as Juana la Loca, spent nearly half a century behind locked doors at the behest of her own father and later her son. According to multiple historical sources, including an article in The Guardian, she was confined for 46 years, from 1509 until her death in 1555. Publicly, they called her mad, painting a tragic picture of an unhinged queen incapable of ruling. Yet modern historians, citing archived letters, court records, and the occasional testimony of court physicians, suggest her mental instability might have been overstated to justify stripping her of authority. This stark contrast between the official narrative and the subtler truths revealed in personal correspondence and medical notes calls into question who really held the power and what they were willing to do to keep it. Joanna was the third child of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. She married Philip the Handsome of the Habsburg dynasty, forging a potent alliance. By lineage, Joanna was the rightful Queen of Castile after her mother's death, making her a figure of immense importance in the dynastic chessboard of early 16th century Europe. But her father, Ferdinand, unwilling to relinquish his grip on Castile, soon found ways to undermine her. The Guardian references show that Ferdinand declared her mentally unfit to govern, effectively sidelining her. Later, her own son, Charles V, followed in his grandfather's footsteps, keeping her isolated in Tordesillas. Over time, the official story hammered home the idea that she was Juana la Loca, the insane queen locked away because of her unstable mind. Traditional textbooks repeated the tale. A woman so consumed by jealousy at her husband's death or so lost in delusions that she posed a danger to herself and the realm. Yet if you look beyond the tidy official version, a murkier picture emerges. Modern researchers have dug into Joanna's surviving letters, some of which are stored in Spanish archives, though references to them can also be found in historical blogs, specialized Wikipedia articles, or academic papers available on Google Scholar. While these letters do show her despair over Philip's death and her frustration with the political constraints around her, they do not read like the ravings of a lunatic. Instead, they suggest a woman well aware of the power placed swirling around her, a woman who occasionally pleaded to be released or to be allowed to exercise her rightful authority. Court physician reports, though spotty, further muddy the waters. Some wrote that Joanna could be melancholy or prone to emotional outbursts, but the same or similar documents point out that her basic reasoning skills and physical health seemed fundamentally intact. Of course, melancholy in the 16th century could mean anything from sorrow to mild depression. None of it definitively proves she was out of touch with reality. From the vantage point of realpolitik, the more you consider it, the more it seems her father Ferdinand and then her son Charles had every motive to keep her isolated. Controlling Castile meant controlling its vast resources, not to mention the American territories that came under the Castilian crown after Columbus's voyages. Joanna's father used her alleged madness to maintain his power as regent. When Ferdinand died, the question of Joanna's capacity resurfaced, but Charles, who soon reigned as Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, was not about to cede the authority that came with the Castilian throne. He, too, found it convenient to let the tale of Joanna's madness linger. And so her captivity dragged on for decades, locked away in the fortress-like palace of Tordesillas. Contemporary accounts vary. A few visitors who saw Joanna described her as sometimes distressed, but they attributed it to her imprisonment. One has to imagine that being locked up year after year, with restricted social contact and minimal personal freedom, would be enough to push anyone toward despair. The bigger question is whether she was mad before her confinement, or if the psychological strain caused by isolation exacerbated her condition. The Guardian piece underscores that historians remain divided, though there is growing consensus that her mental health issues, whatever they were, did not automatically render her incompetent to rule. Instead, the evidence leans towards seeing her as a victim of a systematic power grab orchestrated by her own kin. This dynamic of a family forcibly sidelining a relative under the pretext of mental unfitness or emotional instability has parallels in other eras and circles. We need only glance at the struggles of Christina Onassis in modern times, the heiress to a vast shipping fortune, whose personal battles were sometimes overshadowed by rumors of mental health crises or drug dependence. While her case is not identical to Joanna's, it reflects how powerful families can close ranks, dictate a narrative to the media or the public, and manipulate the person at the center under the guise of protection or concern. Another modern echo is the controversy surrounding Brooke Astor, the American philanthropist whose later years became a battleground between relatives accusing each other of elder abuse and manipulation of her fortune. In both these examples, we see how controlling someone's fate, especially an heir or a wealthy widow, can involve claims about their state of mind, whether or not those claims are fully accurate. The difference, of course, is that Joanna's story took place in the early 1500s, in a world where the monarchy held near absolute power. No independent judiciary was likely to challenge Ferdinand or Charles about the legitimacy of her confinement. No newspapers or social media outlets existed to stir public outrage. The medieval Plantagenets over in England had famously faced public rebellions or noble uprisings when power shifted. But in Joanna's case, we see a more subtle dynamic. Confine her quietly. Let court gossip swirl about her alleged madness, and ensure that few among the aristocracy see her for themselves. The monarchy managed the optics tightly. The result was a narrative that endured for centuries, labeling her as the insane queen who, in some versions of the story, even carried her husband's coffin around out of morbid obsession, a detail that modern historians doubt ever happened quite the way the old rumors claimed. She remained in Tordesillas. The imprisonment was not just symbolic, it was physical and unrelenting, lasting from 1509 until her death in 1555. If you do the math, that's 46 years, a lifespan in itself. Wikipedia articles on her life point out that her living conditions fluctuated. Sometimes the guardians let her have small freedoms or allowed her to attend certain religious ceremonies. Other times, she was kept under strict watch, rarely permitted to speak with outsiders. Sources from the era mention that her daughter Catherine, born to Joanna and Philip, lived with her in Tordesillas for a time, offering a bit of familial companionship. But even that changed when Catherine came of age to marry. Meanwhile, Charles V, building his reputation as a mighty emperor who presided over an empire on which the sun never set, had little interest in presenting an alternative version of events. The official line was simpler: the Queen is not well. The question of madness as a political tool is fascinating. In historical contexts, especially in medieval or early modern Europe, labeling someone insane or even hinting at it could be a quick route to disqualify them from power. Women were especially vulnerable since strong-willed or outspoken behavior was often recast as hysterical or unnatural. The example of Joanna resonates with other lesser-known aristocratic figures who were declared unfit for inheritance due to alleged mental health problems. By emphasizing Joanna's incapacity, Ferdinand and Charles not only seized Castile, but kept it. When you consider how important Castile was, arguably the most powerful of the Spanish kingdoms, overshadowing even Aragon, this was no trivial prize. Contemporary chroniclers, mostly under the influence of the ruling powers, had reasons to perpetuate the story. Some 16th century texts describe Joanna's frenzy or violent passions. Others mention how she refused to let Philip's corpse be buried for a long time, a detail that's repeated in various accounts, but likely embellished. Modern historians, referencing Spanish archival documents, argue that while Joanna indeed grieved deeply, the sensational rumor about her carting his body everywhere was probably propaganda. The father and son who confined her needed a dramatic narrative that would play well among the nobility and the church hierarchy, a queen so bereft of sanity that she would not relinquish her dead husband's remains. Over time, the rumor grew into a defining anecdote of her madness. But if we dig into the letters that do survive, we see glimpses of a woman who wrote with clarity, frustrated clarity, but clarity nonetheless. Her writings plead for more freedom, complain about her isolation, or question why she cannot see her children. These are not the ravings of someone living in a fantasy world, but rather the words of a captive aware of her predicament. Did she have bouts of depression or mania? Possibly. Some clues point in that direction. Yet it's equally plausible that the environment itself induced or worsened any pre-existing anxieties. Imagine losing your mother, the formidable Queen Isabella, then your husband, and soon after your father insists you're insane, forcibly keeping you away from the throne you inherited. The psychological toll would be immense. Then your son, upon coming of age, decides it's in his best interest to maintain the status quo. Under those conditions, almost anyone would show signs of distress. There is also the question of how the monarchy regulated medical opinions. Court physicians could be pressured or rewarded for confirming the official narrative. If a doctor wrote that Her Majesty exhibits signs of madness, it strengthened Ferdinand's or Charles's case. On the other hand, any suggestion that she was sane might be suppressed or dismissed as incompetent diagnosis. The situation reminds one of modern stories about forced guardianship, where certain psychiatrists or medical experts are chosen precisely because they align with a powerful relative's agenda. In Joanna's day, no independent medical board or human rights organization existed to intervene. The monarchy's authority overrode everything. The concept of the queen locked away for power frames it bluntly. Her imprisonment wasn't just a tragic event in her personal life, it served a political function. Spain was forging a global empire, money flowing in from the Americas, armies engaged across Europe, alliances shifting with the Habsburg Empire. Everything hinged on stable leadership. The idea of a queen who might assert her own authority or disagree with her father and son threatened that stability. So locking her away was the clean solution. Over in England, the Plantagenets had faced open rebellions when family members contested the throne. Here, the approach was less about open warfare and more about a carefully staged narrative, backed by the personal tragedy of a woman's ongoing isolation. Some myths swirl around Joanna, including claims of witchcraft, but serious historians dismiss these as baseless, a leftover from the same rumor mill that fed the madness allegations. The Guardian specifically notes that while many rumors circulated, the notion of her practicing witchcraft is even less credible than the stories about her mania. She was deeply religious, like most Spanish royals of her era, and there's no record or credible claim suggesting she dabbled in anything unorthodox, beyond the occasional outburst of anger or sorrow. In 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail under King Philip II's orders, with more than 100 ships and thousands of soldiers, all tasked with crushing Protestant England once and for all. On paper, this formidable fleet should have overwhelmed Elizabeth I's smaller navy. But instead of a decisive victory, Spain ended up with ships scattered across the seas, battered by storms and outmaneuvered by English galleons. Although official Spanish accounts pinned the fiasco on bad weather and English cunning, letters from admirals and naval records suggest there was another factor at play: a hush-hush refusal by Philip II to heed critical warnings about tactics and ship design. The king's unwavering belief in divine favor and his reluctance to allow his commanders any real say left the Armada vulnerable. Some historians even compare it to how modern corporations, like DuPont with the PFOA scandal, have been accused of suppressing insider reports that could have prevented disaster. By ignoring dissent, Philip may not have sabotaged the Armada deliberately, but he arguably ensured its failure by shutting out the very people who knew the mission's weaknesses. Spain in the late 16th century was the world's leading superpower, flush with gold and silver from its colonies and wielding enormous influence in Europe. King Philip II aimed to use that might to unseat England's Queen Elizabeth I, punish her for supporting Dutch rebels, and stamp out Protestantism in England. The plan, called the Enterprise of England, was straightforward. Gather a colossal fleet in Spain, link up with troops under the Duke of Parma in the Low Countries, and then land an invasion force on English soil. But behind the scenes, Spanish admirals exchanged letters, some of which appear in archives around Madrid, expressing doubts. They cited everything from the unwieldiness of certain vessels in the rough English Channel to the English Navy's advantage in agile ships and long-range cannons. In multiple accounts, these admirals apparently begged the king for more flexible orders, yet the monarchy's stance was that faith alone would pave the path to victory. According to diaries from the Spanish admiral Juan Martínez de Recalde, referenced in specialized naval history blogs, the king and his court believed that if their cause was just, God would override any logistical shortcomings. As preparations continued, Admiral Santa Cruz, one of Spain's most respected commanders, died. The Duke of Medina Sidonia took over, but he was not the same caliber of naval mind. Sources like the British Library's collated spy reports mention that English informants in Spain picked up rumors of discontent. Some Spanish officers grumbled that Medina Sidonia, although a loyal aristocrat, might be too cautious. Meanwhile, the king still insisted that the fleet meet up with Parma's army across the channel, even though some Spanish captains warned that the plan depended on perfect timing and calm seas, two things that hardly ever coincide in that part of the world. These warnings were quietly sidelined. It's reminiscent of modern scenarios where a CEO disregards internal memos about product flaws, forging ahead simply because it's the plan. Indeed, historians have drawn parallels to controversies like DuPont's alleged minimization of health risks from PFOA chemicals, where upper management seemed unwilling to hear internal scientists urging caution. Things reached a critical point once the Armada was underway. Storms off the coast of Portugal scattered some of the ships and forced early repairs. Delays set in, and the overall coordination with Parma's forces became even more of a long shot. A few Spanish captains wrote back to Madrid. A handful of these letters survive in Spanish naval archives, saying they needed a contingency strategy. However, references in those documents indicate that Philip's inner circle repeated the same line: trust in Providence, stick to the original plan, and avoid letting any sign of weakness undermine morale. This top-down insistence on unwavering confidence might sound honorable, but in practice, it crippled the Armada's ability to adapt. Scholars point out that in any large-scale operation, ignoring direct feedback from the field can act like a slow-motion sabotage. It's not sabotage in the sense of wanting the mission to fail, but rather in effectively guaranteeing failure by closing off the chance to change course. Once the Spanish finally neared English waters, the mismatch in tactics stood out. The English, led by seasoned captains like Francis Drake, used nimble maneuvering and well-drilled gunnery to keep the Spanish at bay. Fire ships launched at Calais caused panic among the bulky Spanish galleons. Trying to maintain a strict formation to await Parma's troops, the Armada struggled to regroup. Accounts from the English side, compiled in the National Archives at Kew, show that Drake and his compatriots were surprised at how little offensive pressure the Spanish exerted. They expected fierce close quarters, fighting, but the Spanish never committed in a way that leveraged their numbers. Historians see this as evidence that many Spanish officers felt compelled to follow Philip's rigid instructions, effectively leading to moments of indecision. Meanwhile, adverse winds blew the Spanish northward, and no immediate pivot was made to salvage the operation. Admiral Medina Sidonia's dispatches to the Spanish court, some quoted in Garrett Mattingly's influential work, The Armada, reveal a leader desperate for new orders that never arrived. It mirrored a scenario where urgent field updates get lost in bureaucratic layers. Philip remained in Spain, trusting that God's justice would carry the day, possibly shielded by courtiers who either agreed with him or feared contradicting him. Like the hush-hush culture in some modern corporations, recall the DuPont case, where internal data about chemicals was reportedly locked away. This environment within the Spanish monarchy stifled voices that could have steered the Armada to safer ground. Ships ended up scattered around Scotland and Ireland, battered by storms and short on supplies, with thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers lost. Surviving Spanish letters hint at frustration. One from Admiral Diego Flores de Valdez, cited in J.H. Eliot's studies of the period, complains that the king seemed to ignore repeated pleas about the English ship's superior maneuverability. Another, from a quartermaster on one of the largest galleons, alludes to unanswered concerns sent to court before sailing. None of them explicitly use the word sabotage, but the subtext is clear. The monarchy's refusal to adapt or accept critical feedback amounted to self-inflicted ruin. After the fiasco, Spanish officials put forward a narrative that storms, not English skill, not poor leadership, were chiefly to blame. That narrative served to protect Philip's prestige, much as corporations sometimes resort to PR campaigns to deflect accusations of negligence. The king publicly thanked God for sparing the few ships that limped home, spinning the failure as a test of faith rather than a breakdown of strategy. In the following years, rumors of deeper sabotage took root in gossip circles, especially in foreign courts that wanted to cast the Spanish in an even worse light. Some whispered about bribes from English agents or internal Hapsburg betrayals. Modern historians have scoured archives for any sign of real treachery among Spanish officers, but nothing substantial appears. Those rumors likely emerged from a scenario that in many ways looked self-sabotaging: a monarchy ignoring basic naval wisdom, a commander forced to adhere to unrealistic plans, and captains left with no authority to pivot. The fiasco was so colossal that outsiders assumed it had to be more than mere incompetence. But the simpler explanation is often the correct one. A leadership culture that shut down dissent can doom even the mightiest endeavors. It's worth comparing this to King Richard I's alleged crusade embezzlement, another historical case of questionable leadership interfering with a grand military campaign. Richard the Lionheart was rumored to have diverted funds from the general war chest for personal fortifications, undermining the broader effort. In the case of Philip II, the problem wasn't money so much as misguided faith and authoritarian command. Still, the similarities stand. In both episodes, you have a top ruler placing personal or ideological priorities above the practical realities on the ground. The result? Missions that could have succeeded ended up faltering, or in the Armada's case, sinking. During and after the Armada's humiliating retreat, Spanish courtiers close to the king tried to hush up any documents that contradicted the official story of storms and destiny. A few were more candid in private letters. Bernardino de Mendoza, once Spain's ambassador in England, hinted to associates that if the king had allowed more tactical freedom, the outcome might have been drastically different. Some of these private letters turned up in Spanish noble family archives, glimpsed by 20th century researchers piecing together the behind-the-scenes drama. Meanwhile, Captain Francisco de Cuellar penned a now famous account of his harrowing escape after shipwreck in Ireland. Though his focus was on survival rather than blame, readers can sense the disarray that reigned in the fleet, disarray partly triggered by confusion and lack of clear instructions from the top. No single document declares the king sabotaged the armada, which is why serious scholars label it an unintended sabotage or sabotage by leadership blindness. The original Spanish phrase for what happened might be closer to negligence or obstinate faith. Philip II believed unwaveringly that right and might were on his side. Listening to warnings that suggested otherwise would have contradicted his worldview and threatened the monarchy's facade of total authority. The hush-hush approach also means we don't have a neat paper trail describing the king's private instructions to ignore certain concerns. It resembles how, in more contemporary times, certain corporate emails about critical hazards might be quietly purged or locked behind legal privilege. The aftermath, however, speaks volumes. A once invincible superpower was left scrambling to explain how it lost so many ships to an opponent that had seemed outmatched on paper. The English side, of course, exalted this as a divine sign favoring Elizabeth's reign, coining the phrase Protestant wind for the storms that aided them. Yet behind their triumph was also a well-organized maritime strategy. Smaller, faster ships with better guns, plus leaders like Drake and John Hawkins, who had long studied Spanish naval methods. That said, they benefited immensely from Spanish inflexibility. If the Armada had been free to adapt, or if the Duke of Parma's troops had been successfully ferried across, the story could have ended quite differently. Naval historians emphasize that in warfare, the side able to adjust quickly often wins. The Spanish monarchy's hush-hush methods and refusal to let admirals pivot starved the Armada of that crucial flexibility. Examining direct evidence of sabotage calls for investigating Spanish admiral correspondence and English spy reports. The Spanish letters, many stored in the Archivo General de Simancas, reveal repeated requests for more autonomy. English spies documented in the Cecil and Walsingham papers occasionally mention overhearing Spanish officers speak disparagingly of the king's unwavering instructions. But no one wrote down a secret order from Philip that said, "Do not deviate." Instead, the monarchy's stance was conveyed through a culture that prized loyalty and piety above all else. A captain or admiral who challenged that might be dismissed or worse. In this sense, the sabotage rumor is plausible as an outgrowth of a system where everyone feared stepping out of line, like employees in a corporation who suspect something is off, but see how whistleblowers are punished. A parallel can be drawn to how Richard I's crusade ended up overshadowed by local feuds and personal ambitions. So too did the Spanish Armada's mission become a victim of the king's personal convictions. Where Richard might have diverted taxes for fortifications, Philip diverted attention away from the warnings that a new type of naval warfare was emerging, one that demanded faster ships, more flexible artillery tactics, and constant real-time adaptation. By the time the storms hit and the English attacked with fire ships, it was too late to pivot. This confluence of factors, stubborn leadership, suppressed dissent, unexpected weather, and a clever adversary, became the perfect recipe for catastrophe. After the defeat, Spain's imperial reputation took a noticeable dip. Though it remained a powerful empire, other European states started to challenge Spanish dominance more aggressively. Meanwhile, Philip II framed the loss as a lesson from God, that one must remain humble. He never admitted a direct mistake. Internal Spanish documents, as well as foreign observers, like the Venetian ambassadors, mentioned that the king's close advisors also helped maintain a narrative that the Armada had been a near miss, undone by stormy seas more than anything else. This spin persisted for decades. Some Spanish authors repeated it as late as the early 17th century, effectively covering up the leadership flaws.